Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, which is on full cost pricing of waste for local government. Joining us today, we've got Gary and Joel from Resource Innovations. Hopefully everybody will get something out of this. It's a very interesting topic, and I'm sure that if you haven't looked at doing this for your council, then sooner or later you certainly will be. So thank you to Gary and Joel, and happy for you to take it away, Gary.
Awesome. Thank you, Tony. Let me just quickly share my screen. I'm assuming we can all see that.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So as Tony said, we're here to talk about full cost pricing specifically for waste. And as is customary on these things, I thought it might be worthwhile just explaining a little bit about who Joel and I are. We work together, and typically Joel has, as an environmental engineer, has a bit more of a focus on the functional, practical elements of waste and the consequences of decisions and projects, and I spend my time in the more ephemeral side, which is on the financial investment modeling, trying to optimize risk-reward balance. And a lot of the time, collectively, what we try to do is we try to come up with ideas within the waste sector that actually can both be implemented and are financially attractive. I mean, it's all very well coming up with great practical ideas, but if they can't be financed, then they're largely a waste of time. Alternatively, it's all great coming up with a great investment idea, but if it practically can't be implemented, then there's no point in doing it. And we found that the full cost price methodology is actually very good for articulating many of those types of problems and issues within waste. And then to start with, I wanted to start with a bit of a quote, and really for me, this is really about my own stupidity. The idea about this quote is that you learn a lot more from doing something than you do about being taught about something. And we started building full cost pricing models around about 10 years ago. And to be honest, when I first started doing it, I actually thought they were rather foolish. They're quite unwieldy. They were very cumbersome. To me anyway, the supporting legislation seemed vague. It seemed much more akin to a tax return than something that seemed like a valuable thing for business to do. And it's been a very interesting journey for us, because over the last 10 years, we've been largely educated by you all in essence. I mean, the number of meetings and questions, the raft of them that we've had from LJ stakeholders has allowed us to, I think, to refine what we do, but more importantly, to understand how powerful this whole full cost pricing process for waste can be and the values it can provide back to the key stakeholders in council. And then really the aim of this presentation is for us to hopefully share some of the experiences and the value we see in full cost pricing, and also to highlight some of the benefits that we see for LGAs in implementing it. And to start with, we just wanted to go to the legislative pathway or the backdrop that set full cost price, just to recognize that there is a legislated federal and state mandate to do this. And the seed of full cost pricing is essentially in national competition policy. And really, national competition policy really sets the playbook for how public sector activities compete with the commercial equivalents when they actually do. And that's all obviously relevant to the waste business. I mean, waste businesses are obviously performing a service in the community that has a parallel commercial service, and therefore national competition policy starts outlining some of the thinking that's required for that competition to happen in a fair way. And as often is the case, the federal government policy is then basically interpreted by the state, and it's really the Local Government Act and the local government regulations that largely translate the national competition policy into action. Really the who needs to do it and how they need to do it is really what the state guidance says. And to be honest with you, there is some excellent information out there now. I mean, I know that the Queensland government have provided good state guidance. QTC have some extremely interesting, valuable papers that back in the day, the DGLP have produced something. And the point of all this is that the legislation actually is not vague. It is actually quite direct. And there's an awful lot of helpful material out there that allows us to understand how NCP and the Queensland state want us to implement full cost pricing. And if you actually read the legislation, as this next slide speaks to, there are really three core tenets that come out of the idea of full cost pricing, especially for waste, is that the legislation is intended for waste to be more transparent. And by this we mean that all stakeholders clearly understand what costs contribute towards a given service. I mean, those costs are clearly identified and articulated. I can give you an example. Let's take the classic domestic curbside collection, which most LGAs do. I mean, we believe, and I think the legislation implies, that you should be able to articulate to all key stakeholders all the key component costs of that service. You should be able to say, well, how much is the collection cost? How much is the disposal cost? How much is it costing us to do the recycling element? Is there an organics processing piece? Is there an education element? How much is that service absorbing from a waste transfer facility cost perspective? What are the overheads and what are the risk margins? And the idea behind transparency, which I think we've seen work very well, is that it breeds confidence. It means that we can move the dialogue away from mistrust to one of fact. Another core tenet, the second one, is really about sustainability. And the idea that if we implement full cost pricing for waste, we have a self-funding mechanism, which means that we're not a hidden drain on general reserves. We are actually recovering and financing ourselves, which is a great way of making waste not a problem and making it very much stand alone. And I think the third element of full cost pricing is the idea that we want this to be fair. That is, that we want full cost pricing to have a user pays type feel behind it, that we minimize the degree of cross subsidization, and that intergenerational accounting issues are also minimized. And those three things are then re-articulated. Before I get to that, let's talk a little bit about what we actually mean when we talk about full cost, because the legislation does explain this and then goes on to explain how you actually build up the blocks of full cost. For full cost price, for clarity, when we talk about full cost, we're implying that the price or whatever we charge for a given service will cover all of the costs of providing that service. And when we talk about all of the costs, I think we're talking about not just operating costs, but we may be talking about related asset costs. There could be some rehabilitation costs, there could be some commercial equivalent costs, and some element of risk pricing that needs to happen, and perhaps some costs that are going to we're going to incur in the future, but actually relate to day-to-day activities. And the example we often give is, say, a coffee shop, for instance. The cost of buying a cappuccino, what you should charge for a cappuccino in a coffee shop, isn't just simply the cost of the milk and the coffee. There is clearly some time of the person making the coffee. There's the cost of the coffee machine. There's electricity. There's business rates. There's a loan on the shop. There's insurance. There's a whole raft of costs that go into making that up. And I think that is the premise behind full cost, is that we are considering the entire spectrum of cost. And the point being is that if we don't cover those costs, the risk increases that some degree of invisible cross-subsidization or lack of recovery occurs. And if we don't recover all those costs, then clearly it is not a fair mechanism, it is not transparent, and it's potentially unsustainable. So, and then in the context of local governments and waste, it largely contravenes the intent of national competition policy and the supporting Government Act and local government regulations. So then that's all well and good, but it then begs the question, well, in reality, how do we do this? And again, there's a lot of very, very good guidance. And you can see in this slide that we've kind of laid out what we find are the typical building blocks that we need to consider when we actually build up full cost. And the first on the left is operating costs, the actuals and budgets, which allow us to articulate where we expect a waste business to be in the future. And these are probably the costs that most people within finance are intimately familiar with. But as we'll try and explain, or Joel will explain shortly, while those costs are most familiar, they're not always necessarily articulated in a way that we think provides the most value to full cost pricing in the waste context. The need for competitive neutrality is born out of the legislation, the idea being that if we are going to get to full cost, we need to charge a commercial equivalent. And there are some things that councils do that are prohibitive compared to a commercial. Say, for instance, you pay super higher than what the commercial equivalent is. And there are some things that council gets a benefit from by virtue of its position, such as not paying state land taxes or paying its own unimproved capital value on land, for instance. And that moves us on to the three areas that we think are typically the most problematic from a full cost pricing perspective, is the asset elements of full cost, the debt and rehabilitation piece. And I think this is a little bit more problematic because councils have typically, in our experience, had more of a cash operating result focus. and the balance sheet doesn't tend to be quite as tight or as much of a focus as the actual balance sheet itself. And it tends to mean that there is a higher risk that the asset debt rehabilitation side of the business can unwind full cost pricing or be a negative drag on it, as we'll try and explain later. And I think this is the first area where I think collectively as finance professionals, we could actually significantly enhance the full cost price experience by really trying to improve the way that we capture asset costs and the way that we marry up debt and assets together and the way we treat rehabilitation in full cost pricing by having a slightly stronger balance sheet focus. So those give you the core elements of building up full cost price. The next step is really to talk about a little bit more, like we said, about the alignment of waste services and costs. And to do that, I'm going to hand it off to Joel.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. So I'm going to switch gear and talk about waste. So ultimately, within an LGA, all waste ends up at a facility, either a landfill, a transfer station, a materials recovery facility, or some other, processing facility. And what's important to understand is the way that waste flows through the system, and to understand how different product types touch different parts of the whole waste network. So as an example, you can see the little curbside truck that we have at the screen. Everything ultimately generally passes over a weighbridge, and the weighbridge is the single source of truth, to the best of our ability, about waste that comes into the whole network and where that waste flows to. So in the instance of a curbside truck, generally it won't actually touch a waste transfer facility. It will go straight to a landfill. So that service has essentially to absorb the costs of collection, the landfill costs, but it doesn't have to absorb costs related to a waste transfer facility or resource recovery area. In contrast to that, if we're to follow a typical person that actually takes their waste to a landfill or a transfer station on a weekend and drops it off, they go over the weighbridge. They'll actually go potentially directly through the weighbridge to a waste transfer facility, and then that material might get sorted before it actually goes onto the landfill. So from a pricing perspective or a costing perspective, ideally that self-haul domestic waste needs to pick up a component cost of the waste transfer facility and the landfill. So it's really critical that we actually understand the waste flows so that we understand how we allocate the cost, both from an operational cost perspective and an asset recovery perspective. And just to reiterate, the weighbridge is the single data set that actually provides all that information. It gives us the factual records on customer types, tonnages, and the revenue related to those transactions. And ultimately, we can use that to align to the cost buckets, which we'll talk to in the next slide. So if we look at essentially all the products that we've just talked about that the waste network actually receives on the left-hand side, it gives you an idea about the types of products that typically flow through council's waste facilities. And so we have, MSW and C&I, which is commercial waste, that typically would be self-hauled to a transfer station. We've got curbside collected that would typically flow directly to a landfill. And then we've got in the lime green, a range of products that get recovered through that system. And so we know from our previous slide that all of those different products touch different elements of the network, whether it's the transfer station, landfill, or the resource recovery area. And ideally, we would want to be fair and transparent in the way that we allocate costs against those different products. On the cost side of the business, if we just look at this example at the moment, essentially we've got this a bucket of costs that relate to waste operations, but we don't have any mechanism to actually align from a budgetary perspective those costs to the different products. So it's actually virtually impossible at this point in time to fairly and transparently align the costs to the actual services. Just move to the next one, Gary. And this slide reflects essentially a step up in the development of that cost breakdown. So on the left-hand side, the products remain the same, but through the, through finance actually breaking down the budget, we've now got more transparency over the costs and how those costs are actually made up to deliver the waste operation. So at the very least, we've got an idea about administration costs. We've got still a whole bucket of costs relating to the actual waste operations. But because we've got a contract with a waste contractor around the curbside collection delivery, we have some visibility over the cost to actually deliver the curbside collection service. And ideally, what we can then do is we can allocate, thank you, Gary. We can build that one step further on the cost side and actually get to the point where we have a bucket of costs that we relate to the landfill operations, whether there's one or multiple landfills across your LGA. Again, we've got waste transfer facility costs that we have transparency over, and then we've got a bunch of costs that we refer to as resource recovery area, which might be the MRF, it might be green waste processing, it might be the cost and revenue related to scrap steel. So in this situation, we've got products on the left-hand side, we've got costs on the right-hand side, and we now have a way of actually allocating those costs directly against different product types. So as an example, it will enable us, if we to use green waste as an example, this will enable us to actually understand what is actually the true cost of green waste, because we know that it sits within the RRA area, and we can potentially make some decisions around how much of a portion of admin relates to managing the green waste, and apportion some of that administration cost to the green waste, and similarly do that across all the different product types. So what this enables us to do is improve visibility and trust, as Gary mentioned before, essentially to better understand what a product cost is and whether there's any cross-subsidy across different product types, and ultimately for us to be more sustainable. And at this point in time, I'll hand back to Gary and he can talk about some examples.
Okay, good. Thank you, Joel. Now, assuming we've got to a point now where we've managed to identify all of the costs that we want to assign to our various waste streams, means that we now have a mechanism for determining what the full cost price is. And then I wanted to talk through why we feel that, through some examples, why return on assets, debt and rehabilitation are especially important in determining those costs and how they're treated, because many times we've had conversations with people and we've heard things like, oh, I don't believe in return on assets or capital employed, or I don't want to imply a risk return to the assets that we're actually using in waste, and so on. So our first example I'm using is we're going to build an organics facility. So the Harris-Kelly Council policy, there's been a policy decision by Council, and we decided that we're going to build an organics processing facility in 2024. And you can see on this chart now that this is the capital that we're going to spend in green for that facility. It's going to cost $10 million, and it has a 10-year useful economic life. So naturally, the first thing we would do through the operating budget is we would depreciate this asset over its 10-year period. And you can see here that the orange line now reflects the depreciation. Obviously, it's a $10 million asset. It's got a 10-year useful economic life. The uninflated depreciation per year is $1 million. Now, the next thing the legislation implores us to do is that it suggests that we should imply some sort of return on assets equivalent to the commercial WACC for waste against the written down value of the organics facility every year. And if we do that, we end up with a collection function that looks like this. So it's kind of sitting next to depreciation. And if we add those two together, it essentially creates a cumulative cash flow collection function, which I'm going to show you in grey. Now, the reason, and that obviously is quite powerful, because essentially what it's saying is that, we have taken this $10 million, and over a period of time, we have collected sufficient funds to actually cover the cost of that, or potentially reinvest in an asset in the future. Now, the question is, why do we add in return on assets? And it's clear here that we're collecting more than the asset actually cost us? Well, the wordy way of explaining this is to talk about what the QTC and the legislation say. They say that the local government should ensure that their assets earn a return that justifies the community investment. And that return needs to reflect both the debt borrowing costs and the equity costs of building and maintaining the asset. And being even more wordy and a little bit elusive, the equity cost reflects the risk borne by the community in owning and operating a commercial business. Well, that's all well and good, but what does it actually really mean? Well, I actually think that, let's just talk about owning an organics facility. If we decide as the Harris Kelly Council we're going to build this organics facilities, we're essentially opening up our shareholders, which are the community, to some increased risk. There's quite a lot of uncertainty in running an organics facility. Things like, what if we can't sell the compost? Or what if the maintenance costs are higher than we thought? Or what if we end up with massive product contamination? Or indeed that it just doesn't work in the way we expect? And therefore I think that the idea of the return on assets and this equity risk premium is there to reflect that uncertainty. And it really is akin to having a contingency in any project when you do it. It reflects the risk that we're taking doing that decision. And then it allows us then to collectively to build a bigger cash reserve than we would ideally need to help offset these risks. And clearly, based on this evidence, depreciation alone isn't even going to allow for the inflation aspect that may exist. And it's clearly not going to recover enough to basically capture those risks. And the cool thing about doing this, I think, is that if we are allowed to follow this mechanism, let's say, for instance, we do build the organics facility, it costs 10 million, and in the future, and everything goes exactly to plan, we have a great time selling compost, we have a perfect facility that has zero contamination, we can return these excess funds back to the shareholder, either council and vicariously the community. And therefore what we do is via a dividend, and therefore what we're doing is we're avoiding price shocks, and we're basically pricing in the appropriate risk. Now, the other thing that we can do with this, which is actually also very, very powerful, you can see here, this is the reinvestment piece. So now, as an alternative, we could reserve this money and then reinvest that money in a new facility in 2036. Now, the reason why this facility obviously costs more than in 2024 is to do with not just the inflation impact, but the need to add this margin in is also made more urgent by the fact that anyone that's worked in waste knows that the cost of building anything in waste is going up much quicker than CPI. So therefore, if we're going to just apply CPI to this, even if we adjust the depreciation, the likelihood we're not going to recapture enough if we reserve it to rebuild that asset in the future. And the other really nice thing about doing this is, well, the Harris Kelly Council has decided they're going to build an organics facility in 2024, but because we know how many services we've got, we can actually then articulate to the policymakers what we expect the increase in service cost to be. And this is a very, very powerful tool, which we'll touch on again in a minute, which is, I'm now tying the decision that we're going to make from a policy perspective to its financial implication or that its cost implication. And I'm going to articulate it in a way that talks about service pricing, which is a language that everyone can understand. And really it's for the elected representatives to decide whether they're prepared to raise the price for $61 in order to build this facility. And I think that trade-off is important because I think it's very dangerous to operate these types of, especially organic style or diversion policies devoid of the financial implications, because ultimately someone will have to pay. And it's a very good way of planning with key stakeholders. That is return on assets. And I'm going to talk to another example, which is a MRF. We've decided now, and this is one of my personal favorites, which is how we use debt. Now, I'm going to give you another hypothetical example along the same lines that we just discussed, that this time we're on a longer time frame. Harris Kelly Council, we've got a policy in place that we need to solve a recycling problem we've got for our curbside collection. So in 2027, we've decided to build a MRF for ourselves. All-in cost of $40 million. It's a 25-year life of the project. We can reintroduce the depreciation, much like we did before, to $40 million over 25 years. And there's our return on assets piece, which we, following the full cost price imperative, we apply, and we have a collection function that looks like this, which gives us more than we need to rebuild the MRF if we choose in 2050. Now that looks fantastic. We've followed full cost price, we've done everything we needed to do, and we've also communicated to council that the net cost is going to be $140 per tonne uplift, and everyone on council is on board with that because they're pro the recycling solution. Everything looks square. We followed what the legislation says. But we have a very, very good, the Kelly-Harris Council has an excellent working relationship with QTC. So we've approached QTC because we don't really want to shell out the $40 million out of our capital budget. We want to debt finance our MRF. So we're now going to talk about what happens when we do that. So we've got the asset cost as before, and we've got the depreciation, and we've got the return on cap exactly the same as I showed you. But our normal debt pool with QTC is actually an 8-year term at a 5% borrowing rate. So we think that's fantastic. We think, well, we're going to borrow this money, and we're going to use it to pay for our MRF. And then if I introduce the debt, excuse me, you can see here it is, 8 years at 5%. And that is just a fixed repayment that we get from QTC. Now, it's pretty obvious to see here that our 8-year loan repayment in the blue line isn't sufficient to cover our cumulative recovery, depreciation, and return on assets added together is not going to be sufficient to cover the debt repayments in the 8 years that they occur. And this obviously comes from a mismatch between the life of the asset and the debt term. And this is not uncommon in our experience. Typically, we see councils having anywhere between an 8 and a 12-year term for their debt, but typically they're financing assets that often last longer. And excuse me, clearly that means that they're not going to be recovering enough in the short term to cover their cash costs. And then you end up with a cumulative cash profile that looks like this. So you're seeing that we are actually drawing down in this one example against general reserves in 2037 or going into the red. And you can see this, we are essentially getting to a cumulatively negative $15 million position by choosing to do this. Now, I think in isolation, that's obviously not fair, and nor am I sure it's 100% transparent. And maybe as a one-off, we could buy that it's sustainable. But we've tend to found that once you get on to debt, it becomes very addictive. So what you start doing is you start funding all of your waste capex through debt. And if we carry on using ongoing debt annually to fund waste projects, essentially what we're doing is we're building an ever and ever increasing peak funding requirement that's going to draw down against general reserves. Now, the consequences of that are actually quite significant. First of all, it can actually get to a point, if it's big enough, where it can negatively impact the sustainability of council as a whole. And once that happens, the risk is that you're going to need a significant uplift in either prices or a reduction in the capital budget, which in itself is political suicide. And I think that it may also impinge on planned community projects, or worse, it could do all of those things, which is it could impact the sustainability of council, coming, visible through the fact that you've got to prepare sustainability ratios every year. It could mean that that you've got to raise waste prices quite significantly up a straight line, which obviously no one's got appetite to do, and also means you cannot execute on your pre-planned capital budget. And the point of all this is to really urge caution if you're going to use debt, because the full cost pricing methodology is actually pre-financing. But obviously, if you don't marry up the debt term with the asset life, then you end up with this cash flow funding gap. And if you do it enough times, eventually, like rolling up debt on a credit card, eventually you're going to trigger an issue. And that issue is then at that point going to be extremely painful and quite nefarious to solve. So one of the things that we try and stress is not only the needs to ensure that the collection function against a service is high enough to collect the debt, but I think that goes back to the idea that the relationship between the asset we're financing and the borrowing term needs to be quite closely aligned to help avoid this particular issue. And then finally on these examples, I thought we could check ourselves into REHAB with what I think is of a reverse return on assets problem. And the reason I say it's a reverse problem, and this is because we have a landfill, and the landfill closes in 2034. And we have a whole load of mandated license required costs. The EPA say we must rehabilitate and cap our landfill in 2034 with a whole stream of aftercare costs that go on for 30 years. So you have all of these costs that are occurring in the future. And the problem is, of course, is that if we were then to collect against those costs when they were incurred, we're creating essentially a bit of intergenerational accounting. We are essentially undermining the user pays philosophy and asking a resident in the future to pay for rehab costs for a landfill that they actually never potentially used. So it's important when we think about rehab that we actually create a collection function like this. So we're collecting while the landfill is still active to offset future costs, And we've got to be very careful to make sure that collection function is in aggregate enough to offset all of the future costs, like this one is. This is the cumulative cash flow function. You can see as we spend it over time, then the net comes to zero. Now, there is also something else that we found you need to be very careful when doing this. The first is that you actually do need to reserve the cash, because if you don't reserve the cash, then you've collected it, but you don't have it, which means you run the risk of there being a giant capital bun fight in 2034, 2035. The other thing that we need to be careful of is who gets the interest, because inherently discounting assumes that you get the interest. If you don't, that needs to be priced out. And I think we also need to get over the idea that booking an unbacked balance sheet provision does go some way to reflecting the fact that you have a liability, but it doesn't necessarily say that you have the cash segregated to fund it. So in our experience, we prefer to try and set up this much more elegant function, which is collect the money now, put it in a giant war chest, spend it in the future against your known rehab costs, and therefore prevent there being any sort of issue with it being a burden on capital against the general fund in 2034 and 2035 when this happens. And it does obviously require that you understand and articulate your rehab costs quite carefully. And that is also important because we found that currently the cost of rehabilitation, like everything in waste, is going up pretty aggressively. So we urge that this to be thought about in the conjunction with full cost pricing, because clearly it is a cost of making good a site that's currently being used. And then kind of changing gears a little bit, considering now that we've articulated all of our costs back to this slide, and we've captured them all. We've assigned the services. We've applied the return on assets methodology. We've dealt with debt appropriately if we have any, and we've also covered our rehab costs. Now, one of the things that we found to be very successful with full cost pricing is articulating to key stakeholders, particularly council. We've got very good traction with explaining, first of all, that all of the costs that we have in finance, all of them, asset costs, rehab costs, whatever, equal in quantum all of the costs we've assigned to products. So if we were to sum up the costs on the left-hand side, they to the dollar will equal the sum of the costs on the right-hand side. It kind of articulates the idea that this is kind of the start of the idea that this is a zero-sum game. And then it starts engaging key stakeholders to understand that lowering the cost, the fees, or the utility charges for one service naturally implies raising the cost of something else in order to be made whole. Otherwise, you're not going to be at full cost price. And what that does is that, as this slide shows, it's all very well to say, I think green waste is too expensive. But if I drop green waste below full cost price, it naturally implies, MSW in this case, that something has to move above full cost price. Now, it's obviously not fair and it's not transparent or sustainable in isolation to drop one of these prices below full cost price, unless you have a CSO or you have a commensurate rise in an alternative service. So I think what we're trying to do with this is to highlight that all of the costs on both sides are equal, to get away from the idea that we're going to focus preferentially on one service and the price of one service in isolation. I don't think that was the intent of the legislation. In fact, it's the complete opposite intent of the legislation. And I think that understanding that the slack in the price of one service needs to be captured by another moves the argument away from, I just want to drop the price of this service, to I understand that this is a balancing act and I've then got to some degree minimize cross subsidization, but put it in a way that is politically palatable. And I think that's a much more productive discussion tool than simply saying, I think green waste is too expensive. And the reason why the argument is a fallacy is because, of course, if we then underprice waste, go below full cost price, essentially council has a zero-sum budget anyway. The budget must balance. So it implies that we are essentially pulling that from general reserves anyway. So I think, look, it's a very, very good tool for us to be more transparent and for the key stakeholders to understand that by undercutting waste, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. And therefore, it's ultimately, if the budget does balance, clearly somebody is paying, the same person, ultimately the ratepayers. So it makes much more sense from our perspective to actually, well, let's put waste at full cost price. Let's articulate in a way that is transparent and fair. And it's much easier to allow waste then to set prices at full cost price. But there is a reason why we often see this not happening, and it's because there is a two two-stage pricing mechanism that exists across waste as we see it. There is the curbside collection side of the business, and there is the fees and charges side of the business. Now, the collection side of the business, which is obviously your collected waste service, your curbside MSW bin, your recycling bin, your green waste bin, or indeed your organics bin if you have one, are charged through the rating side. Now, typically, there is a commitment at the council level to cap rates rises, which clearly is extremely dangerous in waste because, or even arguably absurd, because capital costs in waste are outstripping inflation by a huge margin. I was looking at just the construction cost index a few days ago, and that's twice CPI, and that's before we even get to the idea that there is going to be probably an awful lot of cost rises because of the lack of availability of any service or machinery through COVID. So it's clear to see that on the collection side alone, if we cap our rates rises and we do the same to waste, that essentially we are invariably making waste less and less sustainable in the long term. And eventually we are going to reach a point where that is going to have to undergo a correction. And as unbelievable as it sounds, we've actually seen that quite frequently, and it gets you to a very difficult political position where you're underwater, but no one then really knows or wants to actually make the adjustments necessary to bring you back to where you need to be. And I think fees and charges, or the self-haul side of waste, is also subject to similar political pressures, often the perception of what a price should cost or comparison to neighbours, which I'll get to in a minute, or the idea that somehow waste is going to reduce its cost base and become more efficient. Well, I think that overlooks the view or the fact in our experience that waste is largely an outsourced and fixed cost business. And therefore, it's very hard to basically drop prices when that's the case. And I think we do need to guard against comparing waste utility charges or fees to neighbours. When you look at a neighbouring LGA, you have no idea if they're at full cost. You have no idea whether their pricing is sustainable. You do not know what cross subsidies exist, and you have no idea what CSOs are in place. So really, I think you're better off having the confidence you're going to price your business to be sustainable, to be transparent and fair, and not worry so much about what your neighbours are doing. And I think that obviously would be a more preferential way of treating. Now, this slide's a bit sensational, the next one, is that as amazing as this may seem, we have seen cap price increases at numerous and some quite large entities, and the under recovery that causes has a knock-on effect to the lack of available capital. It hamstrings the waste business's ability to execute, which leads to a poor service, and then at the highest level, be it at council or director level, visibility and confidence declines. And that is obviously ultimately going to lead to a sustainability issue, a financial sustainability issue at some point in the future. I mean, the inconvenient truth is that the cost of managing waste is accelerating significantly quicker than CPI and rate rise caps. And it's a trend that's likely to get worse in the future. And if we don't recognize that, all we essentially are doing is robbing Peter to pay Paul. Our view is that you're much better off being on this side of the equation, that if you do set full cost price, you're essentially pricing in risk, you're recovering against all your costs, you're giving waste the opportunity to execute its strategy, you can set the appropriate service goals, you can execute on policy, you can improve transparency, and you can improve confidence. And if you're lucky, you can return a good dividend back to the shareholder if it isn't required. Waste is not an annual burden, it's not a problem, and it allows the key stakeholders to focus on other core areas of business and make waste a self-contained, self-solving problem. Now, finally for me, and back to Joel, a couple of things I just want to talk to that we think are particularly cool about full cost pricing. The first is that you can use full cost pricing in a very, very smart way to forecast the future price path. So look, take for instance, this is our capital cost base for our particular council. Now, because we know what the forward cost base is, we know what all of our forward operating costs are, all of our costs are indeed, we can then start putting a price path on these, so we can articulate to the policy decisions are linked to a price path. If we get commitment on this price path from key stakeholders and council, we are then basically preventing a future problem or making visible about what we're doing. And this is especially important when we make big policy decisions, such as organics or MRF or whatever it may be, because they obviously have a knock-on impact or a potential knock-on impact to the cost of services. And it removes the risk that we work in a vacuum when we develop waste policy, that we're devoid of the idea that some capital investment in waste doesn't have a knock-on impact to utility charges or fees. And I think under the full cost pricing mantra, that's just simply not true. And I think there's another step you can take that makes this equally more compelling, is that here is a different capital, a typical capital bill profile, which obviously has a completely different price path to it. Now, the cool thing about that is that by pushing through different strategic options through a 10-year or 20-year, we've done 25 the longest we've done, you can then start articulating, well, what's going to happen to the price path and what are the implications of different strategic policies or different strategies. And then different strategies imply different risk profiles and political risk profiles from a pricing perspective. And it allows then to us to start testing these different strategic options, articulating them in a language that the key stakeholders all understand, and then getting to a forward price path that is a good blend between achieving policy and actually also being able to burden the community with at a price point that we think is acceptable. And you can test multiple combinations of these. And then we're getting to kind of this idea that now we're using this full cost price methodology to get to a practical risk reward balance solution, which Joel and I love, for all key stakeholders. So again, it's putting everyone on a visible, putting waste on a visible path that everyone can understand on an agreed price path that eliminates the potential pain that you could have that when the organics facility comes online, then you've got to go to council and say, I'm really sorry, but we're going to have to raise prices by $22. And then on to Joel for the dynamic nature of waste and to wrap things up.
Thanks, Gary. So full cost pricing is not a set and forget. And really this is emphasised by the fact that the waste industry, and particularly in Queensland, is kind of rapidly changing. For all of the kind of long-suffering waste professionals in local government, the 2000s and the early 2010s, where there wasn't a lot of change. In 2018, there was China sword, and there was significant kind of impacts in the recycling world, and obviously there's been a swell of public opinion and more interest in how we collectively as a society manage waste. And so ultimately what that has led to is that there's been a shift of focus, particularly at the federal level, so that they now have waste policy. They've introduced export bans on a range of different commodities that come out of the recycling industry, with an attempt to stimulate the circular economy domestically. And there's a whole range of product stewardship programs that are rolled out through the country. And ultimately, all of these things have and will continue to have an impact on local government, because fundamentally you're the local level of waste management. At a Queensland level, the Environmental Protection Act came into place in 1994, and its real focus was on licensing facilities like landfills or waste transfer stations or MRFs. In 2000, and I think it was 18, I can't recall, I should, but there was the Waste Reduction and Recycling Act kind of enacted the waste levy, and all of you would know about the waste levy, but essentially that's had a significant impact in, I suppose, accountability of local government around collecting the waste levy and attributing back to the state. And also, local government has to prepare waste reduction and recycling plans. And then there's things like the container refund scheme. And the future direction will be around organics, energy from waste, and then a transition to circular economy. So all of these things actually have a significant impact on both the operational practices of local government and the finance and recovery of those costs as local government moves into having to manage those waste streams. And all of that needs to be taken into account when we go through the full cost pricing process. So it's not really possible to kind of do this as a set and forget and then come back to it in 5 years, because waste is a dynamic business. It's changing constantly, and the types of products that have to actually be managed by local government are changing constantly and have cost impacts on the business. So we advocate that essentially that there's an annual process that you go through to actually manage your full cost price path and take into account particularly changes to rehab provisions and your operational cost budget. So we found it works far better to do that annually. You can be far more responsive and actually have a conversation with executive and political leaders and bring them along on the journey. So just to recap, I think it's kind of clear that we're fans of the full cost price modelling process for waste, and similarly it can be applied to water and sewage businesses. We think that if it's implemented correctly, it can have a significant benefit in terms of understanding your business and particularly forward strategic planning. And at the very least, it enables you to have frank and fearless and fair discussions about price, strategy, and the impact of those approaches on general reserves and also your community in terms of utility rates and gate fee charges. So that's all we have. We've kind of put within our presentation today. I think there's a few questions that have been raised that we can respond to. And Gary, I might start off on one of them, and that's around essentially councils that don't charge a gate fee either at a MRF or at a waste transfer facility, or so there's some instances that we've come across where essentially councils have adopted a free at the gate policy for domestic residents, and it's around, well, how do you recover that cost? And essentially our experience is that there's no such thing as free waste. It goes through a range of hands, and ultimately it ends up needing to either be recovered or disposed of, and effectively those costs are typically absorbed within the utility rate. I think what our preference is that even if that politically is the decision, that a full cost pricing approach enables you to unpack that and go back to councillors and articulate the fact that, well, it's actually not free. It costs $50 a year, and you've chosen to actually allocate that cost within your utility rate as the recovery mechanism. And I think probably, I mean, you would all be aware that there's a risk that the advance payment on the levy will potentially be either removed or certainly reduced from 1 July next year. And so the ability for local government to deliver free at the gate pricing for domestic residents will be at risk once a waste levy is applied to those material streams.
I'm just going to speak to another question, if that's okay as well. The idea that, well, what happens in the situation where you have a competitor in the marketplace and you feel that you have to match the price of that competitor, and they're significantly lower than you? And the point being is then, well, shouldn't you end up having to do some degree of cross-subsidisation to maintain full cost recovery? And I think that's true. I don't think the legislation is against cross subsidies. It mentions that they may, in some instances, be necessary. I don't think they're hugely supporting it. But it also begs the question that if you find out that someone is doing something at a much lower price than you commercially, doesn't it either suggest that you should outsource to that person, or that perhaps you should review your own operations in terms of how efficient they're being? Bear in mind that we are adding a commercial margin into full cost price. So given that councils have an access to quite cheap capital, typically have a lower return requirement than the commercial, it often should be the case that councils should be able to compete at a lower price. Not always, but most of the time. And that, I think, is, but if it was a significant difference, then wouldn't you advocate outsourcing that particular function if you felt that the commercial side of the entity or the commercial business could do it cheaper?
If anyone has questions, pop it in the Q&A. We've got a few minutes if there's anything to deal with. And I was just going to ask one about when you were talking about the fees and charges and the rates at the gate. Do you find that there's a preference or reluctance to put up the fees and charges more so than a reluctance to put up the general rates? And do you find that that's where that cross-subsidisation more easily occurs?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in our experience, you tend to find that most utility charges are ahead of full cost price, and that most gate services or self-haul is below full cost price. So you're exactly right that you tend to find that to some degree domestic curbside and commercial curbside are subsidizing some of the gate services. And I think it's a very difficult position you get yourself in, because then how do you correct that politically without creating a bit of a, you know, a storm or upsetting somebody? But yes, you're right. I think that typically no one wants to raise gate fees, much so less than utility charges. But like I said, utility charges have their own issue, do they not? Because if you come in as a 4-year commitment to cap rating rises, then what do you do about raising the utility rates in waste? I mean, honestly, I think they should probably be treated differently. I mean, in an ideal world, I think you would segregate the waste price setting policy outside of the normal ratings and have it as its own standalone, because well, you have a mechanism for doing what the legislation says, so you could follow the mechanism, and if everyone felt that you were doing it accurately, then that problem would essentially disappear.
Okay. Well, it doesn't appear that we've got any more questions coming through, but if people do have questions that they think of a little bit later, send it through to our LGFP admin email and we can try and follow that up. The recording of this session will be available on our YouTube channel later this afternoon. So if, for those of you that want to watch it again, or if you know people that have missed it, they can catch up on it there. I think there should be a quick survey will come out after this if you want to provide us with a bit of feedback on the session, so we can use that to plan our future sessions. This is our last webinar for the year. We'll kickstart off back again in February, I think, at this stage, but we've got our conference coming up. So if you haven't registered yet for the conference, please get in and do so. It's less than 4 weeks away now. It should be really good. Obviously, it's in Cairns. So thank you for your time. And yes, we'll get a link out. I think it's on, if you go to our webpage, lgfp.org.au, you'll be able to find a link there to our recording. So thank you, Joel. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
It's a very interesting topic, and I think one that some councils approach with a bit of trepidation, but I think certainly it does make a bit of sense to actually take that longer term view of where things are going, and making sure that you understand, at least if you understand the costs, you can then make some good decisions about the pricing side of it. So thank you very much for today. Thank you all for attending, and hopefully we'll see everybody in the conference in a couple of weeks. Thank you.